Today's episode is for people who are mourning a loss or who know someone who are mourning a loss. I hope you find it helpful. Stay tuned. Hello, friends. Pastor Tim Westermeyer here, Senior Pastor of St. Philip the Deacon in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. It's good to be with you as always. In the past week, I attended a visitation for a man who died far too young from cancer, and I also conducted a funeral for another member of St. Philip the Deacon. So I'm thinking this week about death and loss and mourning and grief. And I want to say a few words informed by someone who's been really important to one of my colleagues, Pastor Valerie Strand Patterson, and who is an expert on grief and mourning. His name is Alan Wolfelt. I'm going to show up a tiny little book here, which Valerie shared with me. It's called First Aid for Broken Hearts. I would commend this book, and he's written many other books as well, and you can find his work at the Center for Loss and Life. We'll provide a link to that below. And as I'll say in a minute from this book, grieving and mourning are natural parts of who we are. They're the natural result of loving relationships we have. They're healthy. It's healthy to grieve. It's healthy to mourn. It's important to mourn well. And yet, in our culture, we don't do it particularly well. And so today, I just want to say a few words about grief and mourning. And in fact, this book, one of Dr. Alan Wolfelt's points is that grief is one thing, mourning is something different. So there are 3 short chapters. The first is grieve. The second is mourn. The third is live. So let me just describe for you how he talks about grieving versus mourning. He says, what is grief? Grief is everything you think and feel about the loss. I mentioned death, funerals, but there are other kinds of loss as well. So everything you think about the loss during and after the time your heart began to break. In other words, grief is what goes on inside of you related to the loss. When you're sad about a loss, that's grief. When you're mad about a loss, that's grief. When you're fearful about a loss, that's grief. When your body aches about a loss, that's grief. Now, mourning, again, and I am summarizing, it's not a long book, but I'm summarizing a short book even more quickly. So again, with apologies to Dr. Wolfelt, I hope I'm not doing him a disservice by this, but I think it's helpful, again, to lift these points up. If grief is what goes on inside you when your heart is broken, then mourning is what goes on outside you when you express your grief. Grief is internal. Mourning is external. Grief is feeling, thinking, turning inward, remembering, and pondering. Mourning is talking, acting, doing, creating, and moving. And he talks about mourning as the secret sauce of grief. In other words, mourning helps us move beyond our grief to actually live and thrive again. And I want to read this. I mentioned this earlier. He says, we have said that culture is bad at grief. It promotes the idea that loss is often shameful, and even when it's not shameful, it's something we shouldn't burden other people with. Instead, we are usually taught we just have to suck it up, get over it, and move on. We have it, he says, so wrong. And then he says this, if our culture doesn't do grief, it really doesn't do mourning. So, for those of you mourning, again, I'm not trying to overly simplify something that's very complex, but here are some thoughts about ways you can activate your grief through mourning, according to Dr. Wolfelt. You can talk to a friend or a family pet. He says his own pet, his pup, Zoe, has been an excellent grief therapist for him. Talking out loud to yourself about your heartbreak, telling people your story of love and loss, participating in a support group, sharing your heartbreak with a therapist, journaling, writing it down, prayer and meditation, yelling, pacing, creating art, sorting through mementos, taking part in spiritual activities, volunteering or helping others, and participating in rituals, which he says much more about in another place. All of those are again, ways to activate your grief, to express your grief. Now, if you are someone who knows someone who's grieving, and I'll end with this, I want to suggest some things maybe you should or shouldn't do, or opportunities that you can and shouldn't do when you're engaging with someone who is grieving or mourning. And the first thing is, we've mentioned it a couple times even in this short episode, grief and mourning are not things we do well culturally, okay? We're embarrassed by them. We don't want to address them. And so entering into someone's grief requires courage. And I would encourage you to be courageous in entering into someone's grief and simply being present to them. We worry that we have to say the right thing or do the right thing. Being present is way more important than saying or doing the right thing, okay? So just show up, be present. The second point, and this is related to that point about how mourning is the secret sauce of grief. People need to mourn, but our culture often shuts it down. So when you enter into someone's space of grief, you can help them mourn simply by saying things like, tell me about your friend, tell me about him, tell me about her, tell me a story. Say their name out loud. We worry sometimes that we think by bringing the person up, we're going to make the person who's mourning sad. They're already sad. They may need an opportunity, though, to speak about their loved one. So simply ask questions. Again, tell me about your wife, your son, your daughter, your grandma, your dad, whatever it is, okay? And then the final point is, this is something you should not do. Don't come with your advice or platitudes about how they should be grieving. The person doing the mourning, the person doing the grieving is the expert. They're the teacher. Follow their lead, and that means, again, this is so true in so many parts of life, listen. Don't try to tell them how they should be grieving or mourning. Dr. Wolfelt says, when you mourn well, or when we mourn well, we can live well, and when we live well, we can love well. And he concludes his book. Again, he's an expert on grief. He says, as you might imagine, I witness a lot of pain. But here's the thing, he says, I witness even more love and hope. Much more could be said about this, but I hope that at least by raising the issue, it might encourage all of us to talk about it ourselves if we're grieving, or invite others who we know who are grieving to speak with us. Again, I encourage you to look up Dr. Wolfelt's work. If you need to talk to someone, certainly reach out to me or one of the other pastors here, and know that you're in our prayers. And as always, be well, stay in touch, and God bless.